Hello, hello, welcome everybody. Do me a favor, if you're here, say hello in the chat and let me know. Let everybody know that we're not alone. We're all in this together. And welcome. What I really want to know actually is where everybody's at in this whole GMAT thing. Have you been studying for a while? Are you totally new to it? Where roughly are you scoring currently in the 300s, 400s, 500s, 600s, 700s? In which case you might not need me too much. Hey, welcome guys. I am seeing some of you. It is really, really nice to have you. Nice. Okay, cool. So at least one of you in the 600s with your GMAT studying. And it's okay if you have not really been studying much at all. If you're just kind of at the start of your GMAT journey, that's fine too. We've got something here for everybody. But those of you in your 600s, yeah, who want to get 700s, we've definitely got something for you as well. In fact, I would say that's going to form the bulk of today's presentation. Indeed, easy to fall off the wagon, harder to get back on. Just start doing at least 15 minutes a day and build on that. All right, 490, cool. Excellent. Okay. 560 as well. Let's begin. So today we're talking about how to improve your score by 100 points. And it turns out that's not the most straightforward question to answer at all, because it depends which 100 points you are trying to improve on, right? If you're at a 480 or 490, as I know some of you are, and you're trying to get 100 points to the high 500s to just about a 600, that's going to require different things from being in the 600s and trying to get to the 700s, right? Or being in the 300s and trying to get to the 400s, all right? And I'll try to give you some insights, as many insights as I can, into getting into top business schools. But I will say, I'm on the test side of things. I can definitely tell you how the test will help you, but that's definitely not all of it. And that could be its own whole session, believe you me. All right. Thank you, everybody, for giving me some insight into where you're all at. Let's start this thing. So this is how it's going to go. We're going to talk about, basically in order, how to get to the 500s from below the 500s, right? I know some of us are there. We'll just address it first. How then to get from the 500s into the 600s, because that'll be the next step. And for anybody in the 500s right now, that's the step you are at. And then getting from the 600s to the 700s, which I see a lot of you guys are concerned with. That is what we're talking about. Now, what it really comes to is a few different things. Getting to the 500s basically means understanding the test and working on mechanics. All right, that's what we're going to talk about first. Then getting to the 600s is about going beyond the mechanics to figuring out the right way to approach problems. Their problems are open to multiple approaches. And the better you get at being able to do problems multiple ways, the better you're going to do at the test. And it's pretty necessary to get to the 600s to at least have some experience with different kinds of approaches. Getting then from the 600s to the 700s requires basically next level understanding of the test. You've got to kind of speak the test's language. You've got to be really good at your many approaches. So good, in fact, that you can essentially say up front, looking at a problem, all right, I'm going to go with this approach, not that approach. You see both approaches, you know which one to choose because you can see what's going to get you there the fastest. All right, good planning and good understanding of the way the test problems are set up. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. Along the way, ask questions. Ask all the questions you want. Your questions make these sessions so much more fun. All right, and I'll try to answer them along the way. If I don't get a chance to answer them along the way, I'm also going to try to save time at the end of this presentation for Q&A. All right. Because we all have different situations. Some of us are in the 600s and it's Verbal's fault. For some of us, it's Quant's fault. For some of us, it's a little bit of both. Whatever it may be, we'll try to address it. Okay. So do not be strangers in the chat window. Ask your questions and let's go. First, getting to the 500s. Basically, getting to the 500s involves understanding the test, the algorithm, and how to use it to your advantage, and managing your fundamentals, like essentially getting all the content knowledge that you'll need for the test. The rules of exponents, the rules of fractions, rules of algebra, stuff like that. All right, now, we're also in kind of a position in which the test is set to change, as I'm sure a lot of you know. There's the GMAT Classic still going on for a little while, but as of November, you'll also be able to take the GMAT Focus. And after January or February, somewhere around there, at sometime next year, you'll no longer be able to take the GMAT Classic. You'll only be able to take the GMAT Focus. So we'll talk a little bit about the GMAT Focus as well, how it's different from the GMAT Classic. All right. That is our plan. Now, first things first, GMAT is an adaptive test. Anybody who's been studying for a little while will tell you that exact thing. And I won't deny it. It's an adaptive test. You are basically playing against a thing that's willing to give you harder and harder questions as you go. All right. And in fact, my slideshow is being terrible. Give me just a sec. Boom. Now, what that actually means for you is they're going to give you questions in a difficulty bracket. If you get the questions right, the difficulty bracket bumps up. If you get the questions wrong, the difficulty bracket bumps down. But you're also getting a question of a difficulty that's kind of randomized within that bracket. And the further you go through the test, the narrower the bracket seems to get, and the more stable then your performance is going to be. The general truth about the GMAT, and this one's pretty important for those of you trying to get into the 500s especially, is that the harder the question you get wrong, the less it hurts your score. The easier the question you get wrong, the more it hurts your score. All right. Conversely, the harder the question you get right, the more it helps your score. The easier the question you get right, the less it helps your score. Okay. In a perfect world, you start out strong, get to a fairly high level, and just coast from then on out. You do not need to get every problem right to get a good score. You need to get problems wrong at a certain level. If you get problems wrong that are too easy, that's going to keep your level artificially low. And that we cannot have, right? So play the algorithm well. Now, what does that actually entail? It means that when you're starting out, when you're trying to get to the 500s, and even when you're trying to get to the 600s, section management is really, really important. If you go into the GMAT trying to get everything right, there's a really good chance you won't. There's a good chance, in fact, you'll do worse than if you go into the GMAT saying, I know I'm going to get a few wrong, so let me be pretty proactive about deciding which ones those are. If you go in knowing you're going to get stuff wrong, you get to be a bit selective. You get to decide, you know what? I'm not that happy with geometry. Never have been. I see a geometry problem. I'm just going to go ahead and skip that. I'm going to put in a random answer. Never look back, right? You can do that if you know you're going to get stuff wrong and if you know what stuff you would do best to get wrong. But if you go in saying, I'm going to do everything, what happens is the test gets harder and harder, right? You get stuff right, test gets harder and harder. And that doesn't mean it gets to a point at which you look at it and you say, wow, that's impossible. Especially if you're in the 600s or above. You're not looking at a question on the test usually and saying, I have no idea how to do that. That's so strange. It's much, much more likely that you're looking at a question and saying, I totally know how to do this. Let me add it. But then 3 minutes later, you're still working on the question. Everybody's been there. Everybody knows what that's like. And that is how the adaptive nature of the test works. It's not going to give you questions once you've studied up and covered your foundations. It's not going to give you questions that are totally foreign to you, totally unfamiliar. It's going to give you questions that you feel like you could do, but that will take you too long, especially if you go with the most straightforward approach to the question. More on that when we're talking about getting from the 600s to the 700s. All right. Do not go into the quant section, especially expecting to get everything right. Go in expecting to have to burn a couple of questions in the interest of time so that the rest of the section can breathe a little bit. You can, on the current version of the GMAT, get 10, 11 questions wrong in quant and still get a quant score of 49 out of 51. That is entirely possible. All right. But only if those 10 questions are relatively difficult. Now, to give you guys a sense of what a 49 means, again, especially for those of you kind of just starting out, new to the GMAT and all that, and I know there are a couple of you out there. This is how GMAT Classic scores are roughly computed. You can see here that with 47 highlighted as a quant score and 41 highlighted as verbal score, you can get to about a 720, might be a 710 on any given day, right? And for those of you aiming for the 700s, the cutoff is at about, currently, 86 or so combined points. 85, 86 combined points, you're at 700. Anything over that, this would be 88 combined points, for instance, and you're golden. You're getting 700 something. On the current scoring scale, it seems to be about 13 raw points between the two sections, quant and verbal. That will translate to about 100 points of score, give or take, right? So if an 88 gets you a 720, then it's likely that 75, a combined score of about 75 will get you a 620. And here you can see it, 38 on verbal, 37 on quant, 75 points, gets you 620. Right? So about 13 points on those two sections translates to about 100 points. Now, that's important for planning purposes because, again, I can't cover every possible scenario here for getting 100 points better, but if you're looking at your practice test scores right now and you're seeing that you're already at a quant score of 46, and it's your verbal score that's really dragging you down, that quant score can only get 5 points better. No matter what you do, you could spend a million years learning quant and that quant score is still only going to get maximum 5 points better. There's not a huge amount of room for improvement on quant, right? A lot of your improvement has to come from verbal. But if you're looking at your practice test score, let's say you're getting a 640 and you're getting it with a 40 on verbal and a 38 on quant, then quant has huge room to improve and verbal a bit less so. It's actually pretty hard to score into the 40s on verbal because you have to miss so few questions. And indeed, what I was talking about earlier, being a section manager and knowing that you can miss a certain number of questions and still get a really good score, and it's true for the quant section, without a doubt. It is a bit less true for the verbal section. There's less room for error on the verbal section. So for instance, I mentioned that you could get 10 questions wrong, get a 49 in quant. Seen it happen several times on real tests. You can also get 10 wrong in quant, get 44, 42, 40, even down into the 30s. I've seen a couple of times. By contrast, if you get 10 wrong on verbal, I've never seen a score in the 40s behind 10 wrong on verbal. I've seen scores in the 30s. I've even seen scores that dip down to the 20s behind 10 questions wrong on verbal, right? So verbal is a pretty tough nut to crack. That's reflected in the percentiles. And it's reflected even in the fading out of these columns to the right here. It's really, really hard to get 47, 48, 49 above on verbal. You have to miss next to no questions. Even to get a score like 41 or 42 in verbal, you're looking to miss no more than about 6 questions among those that are counted, leaving aside the experimental ones. All right. So verbal margins are tight. What that means practically is even if you're aiming for the 700s, unless you're doing already really well at verbal, unless you're already scoring in the high 30s or low 40s on verbal, that's probably about the cap you're hitting. Anybody can study verbal and get to about there, high 30s, low 40s, but it's hard to study your way into a score of like 45, 46, 47 in verbal. So if you consider that kind of your cap on verbal, 40, 41, 42 is a really, really respectable score, high percentile score for verbal. Think about what that means in terms of the kind of quant score you'll need to get to balance it and to get to the goal score you want. Assuming everybody's, let's say, aiming for a 720 or a 730, it does put some pressure on quant to be pretty strong. Now, again, you can still get these scores having missed a lot of questions, but you've got to plan for it, okay? That's part of knowing the algorithm. Now, a lot of this is a little bit different for the GMAT focus. It's not totally clear how many questions you're going to be able to get wrong or right and get like the relevant scores on the GMAT focus. But one thing that holds true is it's still an adaptive test. You've still got to make tough timing decisions on the GMAT focus. All right. So a lot of what we're saying still applies. Now, for anybody who's interested in taking the GMAT focus, one thing you have to know, and this comes back to knowing your fundamentals. All right. So we're talking still a little bit about getting into the 500s from the start of your studying. If you're looking into the GMAT focus, know that not only do you have a quant and verbal section there, which is of course true on the GMAT Classic, it's from the quant and verbal sections alone on the current GMAT that your score out of 800 is derived. On the GMAT Focus, you'll also have a data insights section that goes towards your score. This seems to blend the former IR section, the current IR section for the GMAT test, with data sufficiency. And indeed, Quant is no longer going to have data sufficiency on the GMAT Focus. All right, so data sufficiency is migrating over to data insights, and it seems like it's going to have a more logical bent and a less mathematical bent in that section. Okay. Big point, if you're studying for the GMAT Focus, is data insights. IR basically is going to be an important thing for you to learn to do well on that. All right. If you are studying for the current GMAT, it's quant and verbal. You really need to learn. Now, getting to the 500s, I was saying before, returning to it now, on either test is going to require that you know your quant foundational topics pretty well. All right. Now, that means knowing the mechanics, right? So knowing your rules of exponents, for instance, when to add exponents, when to subtract exponents, when to multiply exponents, for instance. Knowing your rules of fractions, how to add fractions, subtract fractions, multiply, divide fractions. Knowing how to combine two equations through substitution or stacking. Knowing how inequalities work and when to watch out for negatives. Knowing the rules of divisibility and so on. Getting to the 500s is some of the most straightforward studying you'll be doing for the test, because basically a lot of it is technical. All right. It's getting to know the test. It's getting to know what the different question formats expect of you. A few topics get you a long way in getting to the 500s. And indeed, a lot of those topics are right here. These are going to be the major topics. Whether you're studying for the GMAT Classic or the GMAT Focus, a lot of these topics come up in Quant, but also in the integrated reasoning or data insights section, especially statistics, fractions, percents, ratios. Huge on the GMAT Focus, huge on the current GMAT. Okay. If you master just these topics, and you'll notice there are some topics here that are missing. There's no mention here of consecutive integers, overlapping sets, probability, which everybody's afraid of, right? Combinatorics. Those are good topics to have, but those are the kinds of topics not that you need to get into the 500s, but rather that you need to get maybe into the 600s, certainly into the 700s, right? These are the topics that are absolutely necessary to get you to the 5 and to some degree the 600s. All right. Sentence correction, no longer going to be a thing on GMAT Focus. So if you're looking to study for the Focus, don't worry so much about sentence correction. But if you're taking the current GMAT before the forced changeover, you get a lot of play out of modifiers, parallelism, and comparisons. Those are the topics to like really double down on if you're looking to get to the 5 and even 600s. All right. Critical reasoning, you need to know the different question types, essentially assumption family questions, structure questions, the boldface ones, and inference questions, and what they're expecting of you. Short take on it is most critical reasoning questions are giving you flawed arguments that are missing some crucial piece of information, and your job is to figure out what that missing crucial piece of information is. And same's true in reading comprehension. You need to know what they're expecting of you in the questions to get to the 500s. What do they really mean when they say you need to make an inference or it can be inferred from the passage? Turns out what they actually mean is what answer must be true based on stuff said in the passage. And that's not the way a lot of us think about inference, but it's the way the GMAT thinks about inference, all right? What can be deduced from stuff that's been mentioned, all right? These right here are the indispensable topics of study to get into at least the 500s. And again, you can probably coast on these all the way to the 600s. Some of these are major topics that get tested multiple times across the sections of both the current GMAT and the coming GMAT Focus. All right. For GMAT focus purposes, again, you'll also need to know IR pretty well, which means start getting familiar with the formats. If you've been studying for the GMAT Classic and you haven't been paying much attention to IR, but you know you're going to end up taking the GMAT focus, elevate IR as soon as possible to a full member of your study regime. All right. IR has 4 question types, as you see: table questions, MSR, multi-source reasoning questions, graph questions, and 2-part questions, which have a lot of overlap with the quant and verbal sections of the test, but also have some logic types and things like that that are a little bit tough. Study these, practice these, get to know these well if you are taking GMAT focus. If you are taking the current GMAT, less important that you know this, but you're still getting an IR section. You're still getting an IR score. You still need to have some knowledge of how IR works to make that happen, okay? All right, I'm seeing a question in chat window. Before I go on to getting from the 500s to the 600s, I want to take a look at that. Been preparing for a year now, but still have a hard time with 2 things: solving medium level questions and finishing on time. Only able to do 21 to 25 questions when you do 62-minute tests. Of course, that's out of 31 questions in quant, right? And Amy, you are in luck. That is exactly what we're going to be talking about now. Okay. Solving medium level questions and doing things in time will be pretty necessary to getting from the 500s to getting to the 600s. All right. So what we've been talking about a lot, getting familiar with the test, learning the rules and mechanics of math, and studying those major topics, definitely important to get you to the 500. But getting from 500s rather, but getting from the 500s to the 600s, well, that's a different story entirely. And this happens to a lot of people. Study for the test for a while. Maybe you take a practice test at the very beginning just to get a baseline. You study for the test for a while, and you expect to get a better score because you've learned so much more and you know so much more going into that second test. And instead you get the same score or a worse score even because time gets away from you, right? Or because you know just enough about those topics to be vulnerable to the traps in medium level questions, but you haven't yet figured out enough to get around those traps, okay? So what makes the difference between being in the 500s and being in the 600s? In the 500s, you know your foundational stuff. You know the rules. You're going to be refreshed on algebra, how to use it effectively, right? But getting to the 600s requires you to be flexible in your approaches. All right, that's thing number 1. So if you've gotten to the 500s being kind of a one-trick pony, if you've relearned algebra and you're like, you know what, though, I can use algebra for everything as long as I'm really careful about it. I can use algebra to translate word problems. I can use algebra for geometry problems. I can use algebra in data sufficiency. I can use algebra wherever I want. Yes, but as you move from the 500s to the 600s, and certainly as you then move from the 600s to the 700s, having only one kind of approach that you rely on becomes problematic because you start getting given more and more problems that, while solvable by that approach, will not be optimally solved by that approach, right? And that's where you start running into timing issues for sure. You're looking at problems and you know how to solve them a certain way. And that's all you can think of. So you go about solving them and you want to get everything right. So once it starts taking you 3.5 minutes to solve them, you keep going on and then you run out of time toward the end, right? Exactly where Amy's at. Okay, so how do you get around that? A few things. 1, it's in going from the 500s to the 600s that practice becomes really, really essential. All right. Practice is really important. Now, getting from the lower scores to the 500s requires more reading, right? Watching videos, knowledge acquisition, and things like that. But getting from 500s to 600s requires more practice. Times practice, ideally, with careful review. And it's that careful review that we're going to talk about a lot in getting from the 600s to 700s as well. So I'll detail what that review should look like more and more as we go. But practice starts becoming really important. The only way to really get good at doing problems in a timely fashion is to do problems and then reflect on what could have been done to get you through those problems in a more timely fashion afterwards. That's one major thing. Practice makes perfect in going from the 500 to the 600 level. Next thing, approaches. So touched on this already, but there are, by and large, 3 kinds of approaches to GMAT problems, right? There are algebraic approaches, there are numerical approaches, and there are logical approaches or conceptual approaches, rules-based approaches, approaches that just involve thinking about what you have and what you need in, say, data sufficiency, stuff like that. That's looking to become even more important for the GMAT focuses data sufficiency questions, which are very much logic-based questions and less math-based questions. All right. There are 3 kinds of approaches. Now, that's not to say that every quant problem is going to be open to all 3 kinds of approaches. Some of them decidedly are, all right, but not all of them. However, it is the norm for a quant problem to be open to at least 2 approaches. All right. Every now and then you run across a quant problem that can only be done by one approach or can only be practically done by one approach. But more often you see quant problems that if you approach them one way, can be done. It'll take you 3 minutes, but if you approach them another way, it can be done and it'll take you a minute and a half or a minute 45 or something like that. And you're always looking for that 2 minutes or less approach to a problem, right? If you've done a problem while practicing it in a certain way and it's taken you 3 minutes to get to the answer, I mean, 1, look to see whether you can streamline that approach. If you took unnecessary steps in there, maybe the 3 minutes could be brought down to 2.5 or 2 minutes. But 2, look to see if an entirely different approach would have worked better. You're not really going to get to the 600s all that reliably without being pretty adept at least algebraic and numerical approaches. All right. These 2 are your workhorses. These 2 are the ones that come up in the greatest variety of problems and that present the most difficulties in terms of deciding which way to go. Algebra is a lot of people's default. It'll be good to a certain degree, but especially for word problems and certain other kinds of looks, numerical approaches are really important. And oftentimes they'll work well in conjunction. Maybe you're seeing a word problem that you can translate algebraically, but that doesn't then solve all that nicely algebraically, and you'd like to pivot to picking numbers. But even more than that, in data sufficiency, oftentimes a little bit of algebra up front saves you a huge amount of time in testing cases afterwards or something like that. So these are not mutually exclusive approaches. They can be hybridized as well. But it is generally the case that if a problem is solvable 2 ways, one way will be markedly better in terms of time and efficiency than the other way, right? And that's what you're looking for in getting from the 500s to the 600s. Now, to really bring that home, you need good planning. All right. So it's one thing to talk about getting good at different approaches. And in getting from the 500s to 600s, like getting good at multiple approaches, even without excellent planning, it can get you there, probably. Again, depending on whether it's quant or verbal holding you back. But you want to start thinking about planning more and more as you're getting into the 600s, like deciding up front between multiple approaches which one is going to be better. And that's easier said than done because you have to have practiced enough with multiple approaches that you can consider maybe doing a problem algebraically and look into the future and kind of get a rough time estimate for how long that algebra is going to take you. And then consider doing a problem numerically, look into the future, get a rough time estimate for how long the problem is going to take you to do numerically, and decide based on that. And you want to be able to do all of that in like 10 or 20 seconds because, of course, you still need time to actually work on the problem, all right? Which is to say, multiple approaches are a good thing, but planning is what helps you integrate those multiple approaches with something that really gets you through problems. Now, planning can be practiced on its own, and it starts becoming really important as you're getting into the 600s, and certainly if you want to get into the 700s. Get an official guide. Go to GMAT Club, go to the forums, punch up a list of problems. If you want to practice planning, all you have to do is look at a problem, no scratch paper, nothing like that, and go down this list. Do I have an algebraic approach to the problem? How long do I think it might take me? Do I have a numerical approach to the problem? Working backwards, smart numbers, estimation, testing cases. How long do I think it will take me? Or do I have a logical approach to the problem? Can I just kind of like take this high level and get there without any real, writing down of stuff, any real processing calculation and stuff like that? All right. Those ones are pretty elusive, especially in problem solving, but they're out there. And then on to the next problem you go. So you can do planning without actually doing the full-on problem, and it is a really good and important step to take in your studying. All right. Another key step to getting the 600s is committing to doing problems multiple ways. The only way you're going to get good at looking into the future of a problem, saying, okay, I think the algebra is going to play out like this and take me about this long, but I think the numerical approach is going to play out like this and take me this long. The only way you're going to get good at making those kind of planning estimates is if you've had enough lived experience doing problems algebraically, doing problems numerically, and seeing how long each way takes you and when one is better and when the other is better. All right, more on that in a second, but I'm seeing in the chat window another question. Any piece of advice how to master this classic version, the GMAT classic version? Yeah. Do you think verbal is way more difficult to ace in comparison with quant section or vice versa? I think verbal is way more difficult to ace than the quant section. You have far less margin for error. All right. The kind of effort that it takes to get a 40 in verbal will basically get you a 49 or 50 usually in quants, if we're just talking about like percentage of wrong answers. Also, a lot of people find that quant is easier to study for, and a lot of what we're even talking about in terms of improvement is quant focused, because there are rules, there are ways to recognize what's being tested. There are certain predictable things in quants that can be studied, applied, and built upon, right? Now, that's not to say that if you really need to improve verbal to get there, you're out of luck. Not at all. There are definitely ways to improve verbal. As you're trying to get from the 500s to the 600s in terms of improving verbal, sentence correction tends to be about your best friend there. I mentioned parallelism, modifiers, and comparisons before, and this again is just for the GMAT current version, not the GMAT focus, but I mentioned parallelism, modifiers, and comparisons before. Getting really good at those topics is usually going to get you a decent enough verbal score that you're not locked out of the 600s, as long as you've got a decent quant score as well. Getting from the 600s to the 700s on the verbal side, though, that's significantly trickier and requires some like closer, more assiduous study and review, and that we're going to talk about before too long. All right. But yeah, by and large, I think quant is easier to, I wouldn't say ace, like it's hard to get a 51 in quant still, but it's easier to get a 48, 49, 50 in quant than it would be to get anywhere near that score in verbal. And again, that's reflected in the percentiles. That's why a 47 in quant kind of looks like not a great percentile score, whereas a 47 in verbal, you're deep into the 99th percentile. That's the percentiles are somewhat reflective of the difficulty of getting those scores. Akanksha asks, is it possible to improve the score by 100 points in just a month? Yes, but again, it depends on kind of where you're at. So one of the truths about improving the scores is basically the higher your score is, the harder the 100 points are to get. And that, I think, makes sense, right? If you're at a 400, you've got 400 points of upward mobility there. Getting 100 of those 400 points is a lot more doable than if you're at a 600, you've got 200 points of upward mobility and you're trying to get 100 of those 200 points, right? It, I think, kind of stands to reason. So it depends on where you're at. It, of course, depends on how much time you have to study. But is it possible to improve 100 points in a month? Yes. I would say it would require, again, depending a lot on where you're at, where you're starting from, those 100 points, it would require at least 10, 20 hours a week of studying, I would say, for most people. All right. All right. Ujjwal is bringing up, I think, a really, really good point. And this gets back to what I'm talking about with regards to planning, right? You start with one approach, you get halfway through it, and then you realize, man, I should have done this other approach, right? When you're studying, that's fine. On the test, not ideal, right? And so where you want to get to with your studying is to a place at which, in looking at the problem initially, you've kind of played out those two things already and decided, no, I can see myself like getting halfway through this, or I can see this taking like 3 minutes, but I can see this one taking like a minute. I should just go with this one to begin with, the one that takes a minute to begin with, right? That's planning. Planning is meant to resolve that issue, but it's easier said than done, right? The process, the study process, as it looks from your point of view, is going to be basically, you have that experience on a problem, right? You start doing a problem one way, and let's say you see it through that way, right? When you review the problem, and especially when you're reviewing the problem and you're in the 600s and trying to move on, you want to do the problem a second way. So if you've done it algebraically the first time, you push yourself on reviewing the problem, not to go straight to the explanations at all, but to do it numerically. And if the numerical approach works out better, reflect on why. Why did the numerical approach work out better in this problem? What were the key features in this problem that could have told me the numerical approach would work out better? If you saw it halfway through doing it one way, right? You saw, oh man, I should have gone this other way. What in that one moment showed you that you should have gone the other way, right? Was it something new you noticed in the problem? Was it that that's when the other kind of approach just suddenly popped into head? Was it that the approach you were doing was taking longer than you thought it was going to, and you just started having regrets about choosing that approach because now you're seeing, hey, wait a second, this is getting a little bit out of hand. Whatever it may be, when you're studying, that's something you reflect on afterwards. How did I get myself into doing the approach that I did? How should I have seen that I could have done the other approach? How predictable was it that the approach I chose was going to take me more time? Did I know it was going to take me more time along the way? I didn't just think of the other approach up front, because then your takeaway is think of the approaches up front, do some planning practice to help yourself with that, right? Now, inevitably, it's going to happen sometimes on the test, right? What you're really looking to do is minimize how often that happens on the test. And it happens to all of us. Like, I go into a test, I've been doing this a long time. I'll still do some problems in a less than perfectly efficient way, right? Because the other way just doesn't occur to me at the time, or I don't want to sit around spending too much time trying to think about another way when I've got a way already on my hands and I know I can get it done if I just put in the effort and spend a little extra time on it. And that's fine if I've got the time to spend, but if I'm already behind on time, then I've either got to say, you know what, this way I can think of a way it's going to take me forever to do, I don't have the time for it, or I think of another way to do it then and there, right? But essentially, it's going to happen to us sometimes on the test, but as long as in more and more problems, you're able to choose the optimal approach, then you're making space to do some problems in a less than optimal way without having serious regrets or repercussions from it, all right? Basically, planning is the remedy to that, and reviewing by considering whether you took the best approach and whether something else could have been done, okay? Avinash, last minute tip. I mean, it depends what's keeping your verbal back more than anything. I would say that in a week's time, again, depending on what is keeping your verbal back, you might be best off doubling down on critical reasoning. But if critical reasoning is the strongest part of your verbal, then probably sentence correction. And again, I'm going to speak to how to study well for verbal as we get to this. Let's, in fact, wrap up our 600s, getting into the 600s discussion by taking a look at this problem. Take a look at this problem. And what I want you to do is a little bit of planning practice right now. Think, is there an algebraic approach to this problem? Could I do this problem algebraically? Is there a numerical approach to this problem? Could I do it numerically? Is there a straight logical or conceptual approach to this problem? Could I do it that way? And which one should I choose? Now, when you're doing planning practice initially, you can spend half a minute, 2 minutes on this planning thing. Eventually, you want the planning part of your problem-solving process, including the reading of the problem, to take about 30 seconds or so. That's a reasonable investment. Think of it as kind of like brainstorming the question the way you would for the essay or something like that, right? But over time, like eventually you want to get there. In the beginning, take the time to plan. It's going to feel clumsy and slow at first. It'll get faster with practice. Yeah. All right. So think about how you would plan this problem. And Avinash, yeah, I would probably double down on SC, and especially those big three topics. Like parallelism tends to be pretty huge on the test. And if you really, really know your way around parallelism and modifiers, you can get a lot of sentence correction questions right behind it without a huge amount of time outlay. But that also involves getting good at recognizing when those topics are being tested. How do you know it's a parallelism question? How do you know it's a modifiers question, not just like learning the process form? That's where I'd probably spend my time in the last week. Recognition and process on parallels, modifiers, maybe comparisons. Reading comprehension is pretty hard to significantly improve in a week. Now, looking at this problem, I would imagine the algebraic approach isn't all that hard to come up with, at least, right? It's going to involve making some equations, right? We have two unknowns, price of a toothbrush, and this certain number of toothbrushes. And so you're going to need two equations to solve for it, right? This is how planning kind of goes. If you're thinking about the algebraic approach, it's translation into equations. There are two unknowns, that means two equations. And if you have the kind of like rough form of the equations in your mind, you can get a sense of how long it's likely to take algebraically. This is essentially a price times quantity setup, right? Price per item times number of items equals total cost. And because you've got variables being multiplied here, price times quantity, both of which are variables, both of which are unknown. If you do this algebraically, if you see it all the way through, it's going to turn into a quadratic. And that's the sort of thing you get from experience. Having seen problems, having seen word problems like this, price times quantity problems, or things like that, having seen them turn into quadratics, or just having seen systems of equations with multiplication of variables turn into quadratics, you can look at that and say, okay, plan-wise, I could do this algebraically. I feel maybe pretty good on the translation. I could do that pretty quickly. But the quadratic side of things, that's going to take some writing, some doing, some factoring. I don't know about all of that, right? That's maybe not the best plan, but that's at least the algebraic side of planning. There's also a numerical approach here, right? Word problems tend to be the most open to numerical approaches, generally speaking. And the two key numerical approaches on word problems are going to be smart numbers, just making up your own number or numbers out of thin air and working backwards, taking the answer choices, testing them out until you narrow it down to the right one. And that's the one that would work here. We have concrete answer choices, right? All dollar figures. They represent a fairly useful value, how much Misha paid for a single toothbrush before the discount. If you have a value for that, the price of a single toothbrush before the discount, you can go back to the problem, find the certain number of toothbrushes she could purchase for $60, and then keep going through the story. Add 5 more toothbrushes, do a discount of $1, see if it comes out equal to $60. And that's how you'd want to play it through in your head, all right? You might have to test a couple of answer choices. When you're working backwards from the answers, you don't start from A usually or from E, but rather test B and D, and you'll know what the answer is, or start from C and work your way up or down. But that all goes into your planning and your time estimation for the problem. Do you feel like you could get through that arithmetic faster, or do you feel like you could get through the algebra faster? Again, you'll have a clearer and clearer sense of this the more often you do problems algebraically and do those same problems numerically or conceptually or whatever. That part of planning, the like time estimate part of planning, only comes with practice. No substitute for it. Now, in case anybody's wondering, most people find this problem faster to either do numerically or through a hybrid approach, getting the two equations out there, price times quantity equals 60 and price minus 1 times quantity plus 5 equals 60, and then plugging in answers to those equations, or just plugging in answers to the problem, starting at like $4, saying, okay, if she plans to buy a certain number of $4 toothbrushes for a total cost of $60, she's getting 15 toothbrushes, and then proceed through the problem. If she buys 5 more, that would be 20. She gets a discount of $1 in each, that would be $3, and so on. All right. You will only get good at deciding this if you commit, though, in getting to the 600s and beyond, to doing problems you practice in more than one way. All right, really, really important to do problems in more than one way. Even if you get a problem right when practicing it, go back and try to do it another way. You're in the 600s, especially, and you're trying to get to the 700s, You cannot get to the 700s without some element of that in your practice. It cannot be done. All right. To get to a really good, comfortable quant score in a way that doesn't overly tax your mind and leave you a bit weaker for verbal, you need to be doing approaches that require the least amount of effort, the least amount of time, and get you farthest through the problems. All right. And that requires just lots of experience doing problems multiple ways. Now, how to get from the 600s to the 700s. Yeah, the algebraic approach is a tough one here. How to get from the 600s to the 700s. The really, really important thing in getting from the 600s to the 700s is the review process, right? So what does that actually mean? What does it entail? Come on, PowerPoint. You know you want to. There you go. All right. The review process is really important. The planning process is really important in getting from the 600s to the 700s. Basically, in trying to go from the 600s to the 700s, on the quant side, you need to have done so many problems, so many different ways that you can look at a problem and basically disarm it pretty quickly. You can look at a problem and say, okay, I can see pretty quickly the 2-3 approaches that will work here, and I know that this one's going to be best for me, right? Different for different people. Some people will like really eat up the algebra on the last problem. Most people will find the numerical approach better, right? As we're saying there. But you've got to be so good at this planning thing that without having to write a lot down, you can look at a problem and basically pick it apart just like that. Which is to say, the planning practice you start doing in trying to get to the 600s needs to carry you forward into the 700s. But the other thing with getting from the 600s to the 700s, this is really important, is you basically want to almost never use explanations. If you're able to get to the 600s, and especially to the mid 600s, you probably have all the knowledge you need, which means if you're getting a problem wrong, it's unlikely to be a knowledge gap. Sometimes it will be. Like, sure, there are knowledge gaps out there, especially in more rarely tested topics. Combinatorics, right? Probability, sure, there are going to be some knowledge gaps there. I've still got knowledge gaps in combinatorics. No shame in that. But you know all the major topics pretty well to even get to the mid 600s, right? And getting to the mid 700s then requires you to be able to look at a new problem, right? A problem with a new twist or testing the same concept in a new way, and find a way to unravel the riddle and get to an answer. Planning practice helps with this for sure, because the more you do planning practice without writing stuff down, the better you get at basically getting through entire problems without writing stuff down. And that's something you can often do in the 700 level problems. But planning practice really helps with it because there's always something new in the 700 level problems, right? There's always like a new twist. They keep churning out new 700 level problems that are a bit unlike problems in the official guide. I'm sure you guys have noticed this too, especially if you've taken a real test, that like, yeah, the topics are familiar. Yeah, the problems kind of feel the same. You're not seeing the exact same problems. You're not even seeing the exact same traps, right? They always come up with new twists, new ways to kind of like blend two problem types together. I remember getting a question once involving like somebody walking away from something and it had elements of similar triangles, but also rates in it and stuff like that. That was new. I'd never seen a problem like that before, but that's what happens at the 700 level. That's where they kind of debut their most innovative problem types. If you're good at the planning side, you can at least look at a totally new problem and figure out the basic parts of it. So let's take rates problems. For instance, that one I just mentioned was a bit of a rates problem, but it had this similar triangle feature going on in it, right? But if I know my rates problems really well because I've studied them well, I've planned them well in getting to the 600s, then looking at that problem, I can say, all right, I know the rates problem side of this down cold. The thing I really have to deal with, the thing that makes this a 700 level problem is there's also a similar triangles part. But because I'm so confident on my basic rates, I can then spend more of my time and mental energy focusing on how to deal with the similar triangles there because I know the rates are going to be taken care of. That's one element of being at a kind of level of competence to get from the 600s to the 700s. Now, the reason you don't want to go to an explanation is this. Let's say coming into this problem, I keep referencing that you know your similar triangle stuff pretty well, and you know your rate stuff pretty well, which again, you probably do if you're in the 600s to begin with. But you can't seem to put this problem together, all right? You try it and you don't come up with anything, right? Let's say during practice mode, you're trying to do it in 2 minutes, you have a guess and you move on. Well, when you go to review it, the temptation will be to look at the explanation and just see how it's done. And it'll feel really satisfying. I think we've all been there, right? We've all like done problems, looked at the explanation and said, oh, of course, how could I not have seen that, right? But that is what makes the 700 level questions hard. The fact that even though they're making these questions out of elements you're familiar with, somehow the combination of those elements, the number of elements they put in one problem and things like that, make it tougher to unravel the riddle, tougher to really get started in those problems and to get through them without getting stuck, right? The only way to get better at that is to strengthen your ability to do so. Think of it as a muscle. Problem solving, the skill is like a muscle. It only gets better if you use it, right? But if you go to an explanation for a problem that you got stuck on, you're not really using your problem solving muscle. All you're doing is reading and understanding. That's passive learning. And while it has advantages, like explanations are really helpful in getting to the 500s and to some degree in getting to the 600s, in getting to the 700s, reading that explanation has taken away from you an opportunity to figure it out for yourself. And you have to get good at figuring it out for yourself, because when you get to the real test, none of the explanations you've read are going to be apt to the problems you get on the real test. These are all new problems. 700 level, they're all new and somewhat innovative problems, right? You've got to get good at seeing something new, seeing something you don't immediately know how to solve, and pushing through it, getting around that obstacle, asking yourself the right questions, trying different kinds of approaches in your mind, deciding where one gets you farther than the other, things like that. All of that is best practiced by just instituting a simple policy of not letting yourself go straight to explanations, right? At the 600 level, if you're studying, you always redo problems a different way. If you got the problem wrong, you come back to it and spend unlimited time on it, honestly, at least 10 minutes trying to get to an answer of your own, because it's not important what the answer to that problem is. It's important that you find a way around that block. If you know all the content in the problem and you're still having trouble getting there, it is really, really important that you find a way around that block. Now, the other key ingredient on Quant to getting from 600s to 700s is error logging, all right? The error log is huge. It starts becoming pretty important in getting from the 500s to the 600s. It becomes, again, indispensable, necessary in trying to go from the 600s to the 700s, because more and more at that level, your errors are not going to be like, oh, I just didn't know how to set up a percent change. I didn't know how to set up a compound interest problem or something like that. It's not going to be like that at all. It's going to be more, I fell into this trap, or I misread the question, or I did this silly thing in my scratch work, or I just got stuck partway through the problem. I didn't see the way forward. Whatever it may be, a lot of getting the improvement you need to get from 600s to 700s is about tying up little loose ends in your scratch work, in how you read the problems, in how you decide to approach the problems. And that means you've got to keep careful track of your errors and your takeaways from those errors, right? So like, let's talk about the last problem again, Misha and her toothbrushes, right? I know one of you said you saw this on a practice test, you took too long on it because you kept trying to do it algebraically, right? So in your error log, you'd want to note, okay, shouldn't have done this algebraically, should have done it numerically. Here's how I could have seen it when I see these kinds of features in a problem. Concrete numbers in the answers and a question asking for a single useful value. Price of a toothbrush before the discount. I'm going to try to work backwards for a while, right? Now, writing that down in your error log under, say, like a word problems heading or under a word problems category, that's a good starting point. That's really necessary because that forces you to reflect on the problem and to think in a future-looking way about what you take away from the problem and what you want to do differently, all right? Hugely important to do this for Quant. But even that is not enough. An error log is only as good as your follow-up. on that error log. So like you can look at that problem and say, man, should have done it numerically, and then move on with your life, right? But then what that tends to mean is even if you've written the error down, the next time you see an opportunity like that, especially if you're doing it under time conditions or in a practice test or whatever, you're just going to go into default mode. You're going to do exactly what you did before, and then you're going to kick yourself for it again. Instead, what you got to do is once a week, when you're at the like 600s level, especially once a week, you need to dedicate a day to follow-up practice, looking over your error log, the takeaways you got, and saying, all right, you know what? I want to turn this takeaway I got from this one problem into a new habit. Let me go seek out some problems that will give me an opportunity to use this. So for that Misha toothbrush problem, you're seeking out other word problems. You're looking for problems with concrete numbers in the answers. Not all of them will be solvable by working backwards, but many of them will. And that's what you got to seek out. Again, here, GMAT Club's forums are really good for this because you can go into the problem solving or data sufficiency forum, do a filtered search by topic and find more problems of whatever type you're looking for, but you've still got to train your eye to see the opportunities. That is huge. You got to have an error log in getting from 600s to 700s. If you want to make a scratch work change, the error log will help remind you of that, and you've got to then use that error log to fuel future practice, follow-up practice. Now, that's for quant. I promised for a long time to talk about how to improve verbal to get from 600s to 700s. Usually by that point, you know your sentence correction rules pretty well. If not, learn them. And again, recognition is really important for sentence correction rules. Like once you learn the different topics, parallelism, comparisons, modifiers, pronouns, verb tense, etc., you need to also know how to tell that topic's being tested, and you need to get good at recognizing it. You can practice recognition by going to the sentence correction portion of the official guide and saying, you know what, I'm going to find 5 parallelism questions right now, searching for the tells, the markers, and all those things. I'm going to find 5 verb tense questions, searching for the splits that indicate verb tense and stuff like that. But especially if you're struggling with critical reasoning or reading comprehension and to get your verbal score from like 30s, low 30s into the high 30s or 40s, how you review verbal is key. And this is kind of similar to what I talked about in terms of quant and the importance of like finding a way to get around the obstacles you're hitting in problems yourself. On verbal, for critical reasoning and reading comprehension, the skill you're really looking to improve is your ability to talk yourself out of choosing wrong answers and into choosing right answers. Okay? What does that entail? That means that, let's say you're doing a problem. Now, there's some element of process elimination that's going to go on anyway when you're doing verbal, right? Like you're going to say, okay, not A, that can't be right, not B, not C. I like D. I kind of like E, but I'm going to go with D. All right, so you go with D. Then it turns out you check your answer and the answer is E. Again, the temptation is to go straight to the explanation and see what the heck is up, but that's not going to serve you if you're trying to get from the 600s to the 700s and verbal's holding you back. Instead, what you need to do is come back to those answer choices, come back to that question and see first if you can figure out and put into your own words why E is the right answer, why D is the wrong answer, why you were tempted by D, and why, if for any reason, you were put off by E. So why is D actually wrong? Why is E actually right? Why were you tempted by D? Why were you put off by E? Why were you put off by the right answer? Now, how that plays out for reading comprehension and critical reasoning are a little bit different, right? For why is an answer right in reading comprehension, what you're going to practice doing is finding the support for it in the passage, and you're going to try to pinpoint what's actually wrong with the wrong answer, where it's like too extreme or opposite of what we need or mixes up details or something like that. You're doing this in your own words, on your own, before you go to the explanation. You then go to the explanation to see whether you were on the mark or pretty far off the mark in your interpretation of it, right? For critical reasoning, it's a little bit different. In trying to, like, let's say, again, you get it down to D and E, you choose D, the answer was E, right? Before you go to the explanation, you come back, try to pinpoint what's wrong with D still. There's going to be something wrong with it. In figuring out what's right with E, though, you're not going to find support for it in the passage unless it happens to be an inference or draw a conclusion question. You're going to instead have to say, here's why it's right. Because if I insert it into the argument, this is how it'll play out, right? So it's a different skill somewhat. You're going to have to like judge your right answers in critical reasoning by and large consequentially. This is the consequence of it if it's inserted into the passage. Whereas in reading comprehension, it's more about finding support in the passage, support that's already there for your answer, right? But the key thing in both cases is take time on review. The review is everything in improving critical reasoning and reading comprehension. Putting into your own words why the wrong answers are wrong and why the right answers are right before going to explanations is everything, because that is the skill you're going to be drawing on test day. You're going to be seeing these. You're never going to see explanations for those answer choices. You're going to have to be confident enough in your ability to determine what's wrong with the wrong answers that you can do so even without the backing of an explanation. And you need to start practicing that more and more in your study. All right. The more you can start separating trap answers into types, like opposites, extremes, things like that, out of scopes, the better. Because one, you can figure out which traps you're more vulnerable to, and two, it makes it just faster to see wrong answers for what they are as you go. But review is everything. All right. No matter what, if you're trying to get from the 600s to the 700s, you're trying to not look at explanations for quant or verbal before trying to figure it out yourself. That is huge. You're trying to do quant multiple ways every single time. You're keeping track of your takeaways on quant. You're following up on those takeaways, and you're really doubling down on planning at that point, because the 700 questions, 700 level questions, are those questions that are going to take you 3-4 minutes without good planning up front. So you've already started doing planning practice in the 600s, like to get to the 600s level. You need to keep doing that planning practice on its own and pushing it farther and farther to get from the 600s to the 700s. Okay. I know what, if you're talking about 37, 39 in verbal, yes, you should be practicing more on the 700 level. If you're talking about 37 to 39 in quant, you should be practicing at the 600 level in quant. Data sufficiency, getting quick at data sufficiency in response to Antonio's question, basically involves getting so good at testing cases that you don't need to write out the cases you're testing to be able to do so. You can do so in your head. For a while, though, that means you're writing out all your case testing until you get so comfortable with the process that you can offload it to your head. Because you can use case testing as kind of a backup to algebraic and conceptual approaches. But getting good at and quick at data sufficiency also means getting better at the algebraic and conceptual approaches when they're appropriate on data sufficiency. All right. All right, guys, if there are any other questions, you should feel free to put them in the chat window real quick or email me those questions. My email address is on the screen, and I will happily help you. Rakshit, it depends on when you're applying. If you're looking to apply by like January or something, take GMAT Classic for sure. If you're not looking to apply for another like year or two, it's probably safer to take the GMAT Focus. That would be the biggest differentiator, honestly. And depends also how the studying is going and where your score's at. If you're like, I've been studying for a month and I'm at a 450 and I started at a 400, then it's probably pretty slow going, and you might want to think about taking the Focus, just because by the time you're really ready to take the test, it might well be that the Focus is your only option, or the Classic's losing some of its applicability. But for anybody applying this January or thereabouts, take the Classic. All right, everybody, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to talk to you about this. Subscribe to GMAT Club's channel and have a great night, everybody. Like the video as well. Do not forget to like this video. If you don't like it, no one will. You're welcome, everybody. Hit like, subscribe. GMAT Club's almost to 100,000 subscribers. You could be number 100,000. There will be parades in your honor. It's got to be you.